This is Weights and Wealth, your one-stop shop for entertaining education on building a stronger body and bank account.
We are not doctors or financial advisors and must warn you this is not medical or investing advice. It is for your entertainment.
Welcome back to Weights and Wealth, your number one podcast in the entire universe, I think, for some information on faith, fitness, finance, family, and freedom. Today we'll be focusing on that last F, freedom. This is really the second part of a two-part series here around the 4th of July on freedom. And it's also a book club episode. We will be going over the Liberty Amendments written by Mark Levin. Sean will give you a little more of a bio in a second here after we get through our housekeeping, shout out, wealth wisdom, etc. Nick, you got the shout out?
Yeah, so we actually have 4 shout outs today, all very important people. Shout out to TJ, Mad Jimmy, G Wizzle, and Benny Boy.
Okay, that is Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Ben Franklin, and James Madison, I think, right, Nick?
That is, and they created the basis for this episode, so we wanted to shout them out.
Along with a lot of other people. Sean, you got some wealth wisdom for us?
Yeah, so wealth wisdom for the week is unless saving for like a specifically large purchase, like a down payment on a house, or maybe you're in the position where buying a fun car is something that you should do. Savings over 3 to 6 months of fixed expenses, aka an emergency fund, are going to be better utilized in like a certificate of deposit or like a high yield investment or a high yield savings account rather than just sitting in cash. So you should put it somewhere where you can protect it but be getting a good amount of interest on it.
Every time I hear someone talk about a certificate of deposit, I think of the Office episode where Michael Scott's in severe financial troubles and Oscar the accountant asks him if he has any CDs. And he's like, oh yeah, I've been putting a ton of money in CDs. And he literally is putting money into like music CDs, thinking that that's what people were saying to invest in, and that he'd get a return on them.
So don't buy CDs.
Certificate of deposit, not compact disc.
Yeah.
All right, and then I have a wealth wisdom this week too. Is that you should keep flexing those brain muscles even after you graduate. So one exercise we did for this was thinking of our own amendments to the Constitution. I think that was a great exercise because these amendments have like a widespread impact. So you had to think about multiple different things and how these amendments would affect them. Or studying for an aptitude test. Like I'm studying for the LSAT right now because I'm thinking about going to law school. And that test, it has nothing to really do with law. It's just based on how you think. It's like basically like a logic and a reading comprehension test.
Yeah. I took the LSAT like 2 years ago. It's fun. Yeah. I really liked it. It's if you're really bored, you don't know what to do with your life, consider taking the LSAT.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes you think logically, but yeah.
It does. And the logic games are actually really fun. They're a very interesting thing.
Yeah.
Speaking of logic and lawyers and stuff like that, this Liberty Amendments was written by Mark Levin, who is a lawyer, but he's more well known for his talk show, just Mark Levin. And this book was published in 2013, so it's just about a decade old. Levin lays out 11 constitutional amendments that he thinks would restore the Constitution's chief components: federalism, republicanism, and limited government. So basically, Mr. Levin is arguing that these 11 amendments, which we're about to go over, would restore the Constitution. We'll talk that more once we go over them, and then we're going to go in and talk about what other amendments we think would be very, very important to add to this. All right. Ted, if you want to take over the
Yeah. So
summary of the amendments.
we'll start off by just reading what each amendment is, and then we'll go into them more specifically. So the amendments are an amendment to establish term limits for members of Congress, an amendment to restore the Senate, an amendment to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices and supermajority legislative override, 2 amendments to limit federal spending and taxing, an amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy, an amendment to promote free enterprise, an amendment to protect private property, an amendment to grant the states authority to directly amend the Constitution, an amendment to grant the states authority to check Congress, and lastly, an amendment to protect the vote. So we'll be going into each of these more in depth. We did announce that we would be reading this book as part of the book club. If you like this new layout for the book club where we give you the book in advance and then we do a whole episode on it rather than once a month just giving you a quick book review of a weights book and a wealth book, definitely let us know that you like the new setup if you do, or if you liked the old one, let us know. And yeah, we'll get you another book after this, and we'll continue to let you know in advance what those books are going to be. If you didn't read the book, we're going to be going throughout the book in depth. So even if you didn't read the book, this is still going to be a great episode for you. All right. Amendment number 1. An amendment to establish term limits for members of Congress. Section 1. No person may serve more than 12 years as a member of Congress, whether such service is exclusively in the House or the Senate or combined in both houses. Section 2. Upon ratification of this article, any incumbent member of Congress whose term exceeds the 12-year limit shall complete the current term, but thereafter shall be ineligible for further service as a member of Congress.
Okay. I mean, do you think that well, before I interrupt you, are we going to do that for each amendment, or are we going to talk that now?
Yeah, no. So now we'll talk this amendment, and then we'll go through the same process for each of them.
I think that's so. Really, he's allowing for like 16 years.
I mean, if someone was to take over because someone died or resigned,
somehow.
then yeah. But for most people, it would be 12 years, both in the House and the Senate. There have been people like John Quincy Adams. I think he was in the House until he was like 91 years old, and he died there. He was the only person in American history to serve as president and then go back into Congress. But he was a very valuable member of Congress. But at the same time, you look at other people like we currently have, where you have these really, really elderly people like Dianne Feinstein, Mitch McConnell. We've got Mitch McConnell literally freezing when he talks. Yeah. We've got these issues where we have people in Congress way too long. So I know that term limits are a very popular discussion. It's one of those things where it's hard to get members of Congress who are profiting off of being in Congress to vote this essentially against themselves.
It's almost like, do you think that, I mean, in a way, like the president right now, like the executive branch has really overstepped its position, but could you see that as a viable route for this to actually get onto the floor of, the House of Congress? Whether it's the House or the Senate, the president kind of issuing a directive, like an executive order saying like, hey, I'm directing Congress to legislate this or to vote on this,
So we'll get into this in one of the later amendments where it gives the states more opportunity to start voting amendments in. But I think there are people in Congress that would propose this.
I have seen
more populist people like on the Republican side, Matt Gaetz, or maybe on the Democratic side, maybe someone like AOC would do this and propose this because it's what the people want. So if you were to propose this, I think a lot of the constituents would really like it, and it would help that person get reelected.
Yeah, no, I think it is a very popular position to have. I will say though, like the one downside to it is that it opens the door to like more shadow, just more like layers. Because if you think that, you know, Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi and Dan Crenshaw are gonna like abide by, you know, term limits if they're ever imposed, let's say 10 years, right? And we kick out the old guard from the Senate. You don't think that they're just gonna hand pick their successor essentially, and
They
be
they
like,
could, but I think other things could be set up in place to help prevent that. It might be like a different amendment or like a different law or something like that.
Yeah.
So one aspect of that you're mentioning, and it's interesting you brought up Crenshaw, because he's specifically someone I've heard argue against term limits.
Yeah.
And his argument was he did an entire podcast episode on it, but essentially he was saying that he used to be in favor of term limits, but then someone in Congress, when he showed up, explained to him that the people in Congress that have been there a long time know how all the proceedings work. And if you don't have those people that have been in Congress a long time there to kind of guide the process, then the people that will guide the process are, as Sean mentioned, the shadow, all the aides that kind of just stay there.
Well,
Yeah.
and we could have someone who's also elected to help guide the process but doesn't get a vote. Like that's possible. You know, like to help lead it essentially, or to be like essentially like the
Well, that's what the
judge
pro
of the
tempore
session.
is.
And
you know, that's what
what is that?
like it's like a position in the gosh, how do I even pronounce that correctly? I just read about it.
That sounds right.
Pro tempore.
While Sean's looking that up,
Yeah, so
there's
right now it's
some
Patty
interesting
Murray.
Oh.
United States Senate. So, what is the role of the president? All right, serves as the Senate leader when the vice president is not available. Okay. So yeah. So
But
like
we could almost have
technically-
more of like an advisory committee.
Yeah.
And you know,
Moving on from that, like if kind of theoretical possibility, there's some stats that Mark Levin has in the book here. In 2010, 85% of incumbents were reelected in Congress that were running.
how many? Or 85%?
85%. The current approval rating for Congress is 16%. So people think Congress does a terrible job, and then they reelect almost everyone.
Do they
How,
reelect
like-
them?
It's because voters are uninformed, I think, and just vote for a D or an R.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue, but that's
They're
definitely
essentially voting for a
a
DNR.
gap there.
Yeah, right. Did you have more, or can I
Yeah,
just...
I've got another one. So throughout most of this is a direct quote, throughout most of the 19th century, not very many members of Congress sought re-election. Not until 1901 did the average number of terms served by House members prior to the present session rise above 2 terms. So again, like this is one of those things where this never really used to be an issue. Mentioned an outlier of John Quincy Adams, but this was never really an issue. So that's why we have the amendment process to the Constitution, so that as these issues arise, we can fix the Constitution to prevent these issues from going on.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that I don't know, at least the way I see it, that like nobility used to kind of be more of a thing. Like people wanted to have like a noble life, and it was seen more as like a public service. Whereas this kind of gets into what I wanted to say about it, is that I kind of think that people go into politics for like 3 different reasons: money, power, and then like altruism, like wanting the greater good. And I think what term limits would do is keep all 3 from staying in power for too long, which it eliminates the money and the power. But the people who actually want to make a difference, which from what I've heard, it's hard to get to this level of government and be that way. Because it tends to weed those kinds of people out. But I think there are other ways to go about weeding out the people who want money and power than term limits. I don't know exactly what they are. I think money would be easier than power. But I don't know. Do you guys see any other reasons why people would go into Congress?
It sounds like you're paraphrasing your friend Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he said on this, as a direct quote, "Sir, there are two passions which have a powerful influence on the affairs of men. These are ambition and avarice, the love of power and the love of money. Place before the eyes of such men a post of honor that shall be at the same time a place of profit, and they will move heaven and earth to obtain it." And I think that's what we see today. We recently did an episode on the politicians trading and how these stock returns are just insane. That was episode, 77, if you want to scroll back a little bit and listen to that one. But these positions have become not just a position of power, but also a position of money, where you get into Congress and then all of a sudden you're a multimillionaire.
Yeah. So if we can figure out a way to remove the power and money incentive for getting into Congress, I think that would be better than term limits. But I think term limits, it would be better than nothing.
Yeah. All right. Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. An amendment to restore the Senate. This is going to be surprising for a lot of people, because a lot of people, I don't think, know the background of this. I never even learned about this in high school.
You didn't know
I learned about it I learned about it actually when my social studies teachers were saying that America was a democracy. I was like, no, it's a republic. And they were arguing with me, or I was arguing with them, I guess. So I went home and researched, is America a democracy or republic? And that's when I learned about the 17th Amendment. But we never learned about it in school that I remember of. So I'm just going to read through the amendment and then we'll get into it. An amendment to restore the Senate. Section 1. The 17th Amendment is hereby repealed. All senators shall be chosen by their state legislatures as prescribed by Article 1. Section 2. This amendment shall not be construed as to affect the term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. Section 3. When vacancies occur in the representation of any state in the Senate for more than 90 days, the governor of the state shall appoint an individual to fill the vacancy for the remainder of the term. Section 4. A senator may be removed from office by a 2/3 vote of the state legislature. All right, so there's a few different sections to get into there, but real quick, 17th Amendment. Sean, you wanna start us off with that and how that led us astray from a true republic?
Yeah, so the 17th Amendment allowed senators to be elected like members of the House. And so it destroyed the entire purpose of the Senate. So now the only difference between the Senate and the House is the Senate gets to vote on stuff that goes to the president, and they just get to sit in office longer. That's really the only difference. The Senate was supposed to be insulated from the, quote unquote, more whimsical notions that the general public will have. There's a reason for the term limit, for the length of the terms. And the reason that they're different is the House is supposed to reflect the more current political attitudes of the American people. The Senate is supposed to be the voice of reason and is supposed to be insulated from whatever thing is the hot, fashionable political idea, whether that's BLM or the Tea Party. It's left and right. It's supposed to be kind of the old establishment, whatever was agreed upon as the gentleman's rules, at the beginning of the century, or basically think about it, the old heads, like the old boys club. That's what the Senate is supposed to be, so that nothing too crazy happens. It's supposed to be a counter on the House, but now it's Also, it's supposed to be a counter for state versus government power. This gets at the root of what we were talking about with the 10th Amendment in last week's episode when we went through the Bill of Rights, and we were talking about how powerful the states are compared to the federal government in a federalist system. Yes. I'm just going to read a quote here from the book. This is from Mark Levin.
Providing the state governments with direct input in the national government was not only an essential check on the new federal government's power, but also a means by which the states could influence congressional lawmaking without stripping the federal government of its enumerated primacy over certain matters of governance. So when the state representatives are voting on the senators, it is a way of giving the states more power in federal legislation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and going back to what Sean said a little bit about how there's a good balance, because you don't necessarily want a pure democracy. I think you need democratic elements to any well planned out government, but pure democracy kind of leads to like mob rule.
Yep.
You know, it's like if 50.1% of the people vote to do so, I don't know, like
it's the tyranny of the majority.
Yes.
Yeah. That's democracy. That's the direct democracy is tyranny of the majority.
And like the benefits of and like the benefits of a republic in theory are that, you know, there are these people who are like smarter, you know, better at like are the voice of reason essentially, and they can put a stop to stuff like that.
Yeah, and I mean, like we talk about how like the modern federal government and, you know, the current political system is departed from, you know, the founding fathers, and like what their vision was for the 17th for the you know, for the country. But, you know, we've made all these amendments and we wonder why things have changed. Well, we changed them. You know? So like if we're upset that, you know, the current state of affairs is, you know, not true to the Constitution, we kind of have to look at ourselves and be like, oh gosh, well, we changed the rules and we allowed all these things that they didn't allow. And like, you know, we did X, Y, Z. Well, yeah, it's going to freaking change. You know, like,
yeah. And the 17th Amendment was 1913.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That was like right around World War I, the Fed. Telling you, Woodrow Wilson, worst president of all time.
Worst president, easily.
And then FDR,
when we do,
well, actually, FDR is probably number one. Woodrow Wilson, number two.
I would put Wilson ahead of FDR.
I don't know if Woodrow Wilson was a snake.
We should do an episode where we rank all the presidents. Are you guys ready to move on to the next one?
James Polk,
yes.
Number one.
Oh, is that the 12-day guy? Or is that someone else?
He's the one that was Mexican War.
Was that Harding? No. I forget that. All right, moving on. An amendment to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices and supermajority legislative override. Section 1. No person may serve as Chief Justice or Associate Justice of the Supreme Court for more than a combined total of 12 years. Section 2. Immediately upon ratification of this amendment, Congress will organize the justices of the Supreme Court as equally as possible into 3 classes, with the justices assigned to each class in reverse seniority order, with the most senior justices in the earliest classes. The terms of office for the justices in the first class will expire at the end of the 4th year following the ratification of this amendment. The terms for the justices of the second class will expire at the end of the 8th year, and of the third class at the end of the 12th year, so that 1/3 of the justices may be chosen every 4th year. Section 3. When a vacancy occurs in the Supreme Court, the President shall nominate a new justice who, with the approval of a majority of the Senate, shall serve the remainder of the unexpired term. Justices who fill a vacancy for longer than half of an unexpired term may not be renominated to a full term. Section 4. Upon 3/5 vote of the House of Representatives and the Senate, Congress may override a majority opinion rendered by the Supreme Court. Section 5. The congressional override under Section 4 is not subject to a presidential veto and shall not be the subject of litigation or review in any federal or state court. Section 6. Upon 3/5 vote of several state legislatures, the states may override a majority opinion rendered by the Supreme Court. Section 7. The state's override under Section 6 shall not be the subject of litigation or review in any federal state court or oversight or interference by Congress or the President. Section 8. This is the last one. The congressional or state override authority under Sections 4 and 6 must be exercised no later than 24 months from the date of a Supreme Court rendering its majority opinion, after which date Congress and the states are prohibited from exercising such an override. A lot to get into here.
Yeah.
I think we have to read all the sections here because there's many points throughout the sections that are key to how this would work and why it would be good in our opinion.
Could we just do like a quick overview of like how power is shifting by this amendment?
Yeah. So I don't think the founders envisioned the Supreme Court growing to the power that it quickly rose to with what's it called? Case law.
Yeah.
Where essentially their decisions become law. And the founders definitely didn't envision just a handful of people gaining that much power and being able to have that power for life. That's just that's very against everything that they created with the system of checks and balances.
Well, I think Andrew Jackson had the right idea when he was like, well, let them enforce it. You know? Like that's like that's Andrew Jackson's famous quote when the Supreme Court came back with like I think it was like either I forget what exact law it was, whether it was an executive order on his part or just legislation that passed that the Supreme Court was like, no, you can't do that. He was like, okay, well, who's going to enforce it? It's me. I'm going to ignore you, you know, which is part of the balance of power. And like, it's not necessarily unconstitutional for the executive branch to be like, yeah, no, we're not going to listen. So that's kind of.
Yeah. And then so it's going from the judicial branch and then going semi to Congress and then also semi back to the states.
Yes.
So I think it's splitting up some of the power and giving it to those two.
That's a very important point. It's not just shifting power from like the judicial branch to the legislative branch. It's also shifting it back down to the states with the sections that outline how the states can override with a supermajority, essentially override decisions. And there was something else that they were able to override. A nomination, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what do you guys think the 24 months is about for overriding?
I think it's just like if there's an actual issue with the decision, they have to initiate a process to override it immediately. Whereas like, this decision was made and then no one had a problem with it. And then politically 6 years down the line, people start to have an issue with it. Yeah. So then they try to override it. It's just so that, hey, if this was actually a really bad decision that's unconstitutional or for whatever reason, you would know at the time.
Okay. That makes sense.
Do we have any other input here on this amendment?
No.
I don't, Sean. Nothing.
I'm good.
Okay. There's some other stuff that Mark Levin goes into with Woodrow Wilson and like the 14th Amendment, but we can skip over that for time's sake. We recommend you do read the book. Let's move on to the next one. We've got 2 amendments to limit federal spending and taxing. Spending is the first one. Section 1. Congress shall adopt a preliminary fiscal year budget no later than the first Monday in May for the following fiscal year and submit said budget to the President for consideration. Section 2. Shall Congress fail to adopt a final fiscal year budget prior to the start of each fiscal year, which shall commence on October 1st of each year, and shall the President fail to sign said budget into law, an automatic across-the-board 5% reduction in expenditures from the prior year's fiscal budget shall be imposed for the fiscal year in which a budget has not been adopted. Yeah. Section 3. Total outlays of the United States government for any fiscal year shall not exceed its receipts for that fiscal year. Section 4. Total outlays of the United States government for each fiscal year shall not exceed 17.5% of the nation's gross domestic product for the previous calendar year. Section 5. Total receipts shall include all receipts of the United States government, but shall not include those derived from borrowing. Total outlays shall include all outlays of the United States government except those for the repayment of debt principal. Section 6. Congress may provide for a 1-year suspension of one or more of the preceding sections in this article by a 3/5 vote of both houses of Congress, provided the vote is conducted by roll call and sets forth the specific excess of outlays over receipts or outlays over 17.5% of the nation's GDP. Section 7, the limit on the debt of the United States held by the public shall not be increased unless 3/5 of both houses of Congress shall provide for such an increase by roll call vote. Section 8, this amendment shall take effect in the 4th fiscal year after its ratification. Should we discuss this one before we get into the taxing one?
Yes. Sean, could you look up the definition of GDP and GNP quick? Because
it's gross national product and gross domestic product, but
yes. Because they have different things going on, and they include things that
gross domestic product is the value of the finished domestic goods and services produced within a nation's borders. Gross national product is the value of all finished goods and services produced by a country's citizens, both domestically and abroad. Does that make sense?
So GDP includes anything produced within the United States' border, and that includes people with green cards, people who aren't citizens. GNP includes...
And government spending.
And government spending, yes. GNP also includes government spending, but you're not including people who aren't U.S. citizens, and you are including U.S. citizens who are working abroad.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I understand it as.
So I'll just start off here with the Section 4. Total outlays of the United States government for each fiscal year shall not exceed 17.5% of the nation's gross domestic product for the previous calendar year. This is something that has just blown out of control in the past 20 years. So we've got some stats here. In 2002, 2002, it was 19.1%, the spending. So, sorry.
As a
GDP, spending was 19.1% of GDP in 2002. So that's over the limit proposed here, but it's very close. What we've gotten to now is in 2022, 20 years later, we've gone from GDP spending being 19.1% of GDP to government spending is now 44% of GDP.
That was in
that was 2020, 44% because of COVID. In 2022, federal spending was 36.79% of GDP. So we discussed recently on an episode how there's like 13 million government employees and 330 million people in America. So if we guess that the workforce is 200 million, it's a random number. We don't have the number of what it actually is, although we should get that. That would mean that around 6.5% of people employed are employed by the government, including Sean and I.
Yeah, and essentially myself.
And essentially Nick, even though he's not really. It's because
I wouldn't have a job without. Yeah.
With taxes. We'll get into that next when I come for Nick's job in the taxing amendment.
But I also think what this kind of says, assuming everybody makes an equal amount, we have 300-ish million people. So 36% of that is a little over 100 million. So basically a little over 100 million are essentially employed by the government because they're, the government is paying them for their services.
If you just take spending.
Yeah, if you just go by spending, rather than actual numbers of people who are, W-2 employees.
Yeah,
for
but within
government.
that spending, not all that spending is
right. It's like contractors and yeah, like they're paying Boeing a lot of money and Lockheed Martin and I don't know. Yeah.
But as far as this amendment goes, this amendment really tackles out of control government spending and the federal debt. People wonder why we're in this situation that we're currently in when the government is just allowed to print money as much as they want and get out of control with spending. It has effects on the economy, even if it's not seen immediately. It is essentially a tax on the people because it creates inflation.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just, the Congress spending that's the issue. It's the entire system of money that is utilized with partial reserve banking, or even during the coronavirus pandemic, the reserve requirement was lifted for all banks within the U.S. That allows banks to print money. That means that if you give $1,000, to local bank A, they can immediately turn around and loan that $1,000 out to another citizen, effectively adding another $1,000 to the economy right there. So that's
and then
at the local level.
And it continues to compound too,
Yes.
because then that person can deposit that money in a bank,
Yes.
who lends it out, who deposits it, who lends it out.
So there's effectively no limit on the amount of money that is being printed daily, effectively. Yes,
And
it might not be physical
reason-
bills, but it is being the M1 and M2 money supply is increasing daily by probably billions of dollars.
The reason that the amendment here is so important to control spending is because when people realize they can vote themselves money, they're never not going to do it. And politicians aren't going to reduce spending if it helps them get reelected. So we've got a quote from the book here. He quotes Milton Friedman. "It is not in the interest of a legislator to vote against a particular appropriation bill if that vote would create strong enemies, while a vote in its favor would alienate few supporters. That is why simply electing the right people is not a solution." So that's why we really need an amendment here to get the spending under control. And I think attaching it to a percentage of GDP is a really good idea.
Well, this is also where the Senate, like the voice of reason, should be able to step in and not be subject to this mob rule of people voting themselves money.
That's a good point.
That's all I was going to say for that piece.
All right. Should we move on?
One other thing I wanted to point out is that it's interesting that he pretty much excludes the government from borrowing money. Like he's like receipts pretty much can't include debt. Like it's only tax income, which I don't know about that. I mean it's like the way that economics works for a government is much different than on like the micro level. I don't fully understand that enough to really talk about it. But I don't think like banning the government from borrowing money is a great idea, because debt can be used in a good way.
Yeah, he does allow for the use of other options like that. One of the sections, where is it? One of the sections like basically allowed for a delay. Which section is it? Trying to read quickly here. Yeah, one of the sections allows for 3/5 vote of Congress to let the spending exceed for a year, as long as it's outlined how much they're going to spend. And like during a time like COVID, where the government felt it was best to spend a lot of money to pay people to not work. Like if the government wants to do that, they can, but it requires, again, like a super majority vote. So it's more like insulated from.
And in that situation, like they would have to borrow. But I guess he's just trying to limit the borrowing.
Yeah, which I think is good.
Yeah.
I would agree.
All right, moving on to the taxing amendment. Section 1, Congress shall not collect more than 15% of a person's annual income from whatever source derived. Person shall include natural and legal persons. The deadline for filing federal income tax returns shall be the day before the date set for elections to federal office. Section 3, Congress shall not collect tax on a descendant's estate. Section 4, Congress shall not institute a value-added tax or national sales tax or any other tax in kind or form. Section 5, the amendment shall take effect in the 4th fiscal year after its ratification. Nick, you want to start us off? Nick did give us permission to cut him off at any point if he gets too long on
I could
the taxing.
talk about this one for a while. But first, I think we need to define like a natural versus a legal person.
Yeah.
So a natural person is an individual. A legal person can be an individual, a corporation, a partnership, any legal entity that really files a tax return. Not a nonprofit. And I also want to give one of my amendments during this one because it's kind of directly opposed to him.
Okay.
Where is that? So mine is the federal government shall not enact a tax based on income. I want to keep looking into it, but I think a sales tax or just huge death taxes would be like the income would be a little bit more sporadic for the government or the revenue. But I think it's a more ethical way to tax people. So I don't know if you guys have any initial thoughts on that, or do you want me to just talk
first
about
off,
my reasoning?
let's use the language receipts, not revenue.
Receipt.
Right?
Okay. Yes.
Can you say that again?
Government doesn't.
So I think that either large death taxes or sales or consumption tax, not really a value added tax. I don't really know what that, or I know what it is. It's it's what Europe basically uses. But like a sales/consumption tax. And you want me to go into why I like this better, or you want to talk first?
Funding the government.
Let's go into why after. Let's go into why when we do our amendments. But let's just continue with this amendment for now. Sean, do you have anything on the taxing here? Do you have any opinions on, I guess, any part of this? Income tax is probably the biggest part of this.
I mean, income tax, I feel like that should just be not allowed, period. But if you're going to have it, I guess it's good to, put a number on it of annual income.
Yeah.
Probably would want to be more specific about like how said income is collected, unless that's just defined as all income coming into a person's life, whether that's self-employed, W-2, dividends, any type of.
And what's interesting is I think this would essentially eliminate partnerships too, maybe like as corporations as well. Mm-hmm. Just because the advantages of having them, like you wouldn't really have, like, because you are taxed at the individual level for any income from a partnership or S corporation. And if you're going to be taxed at 15% at that level, which it's currently 0, and you would also be taxed at 15% if you are part of a corporation, and you're not getting the legal benefits of having a corporation, then there wouldn't be a point to a partnership. Everyone would just be shareholders in a C corporation.
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
I think another part of this, we talk about how we need to increase taxes if we get rid of income tax or if we lower income tax. I think this also goes back to spending. I'm going to read a little bit from the book here for those that didn't read it. Is worth remembering that the framers, this is Mark Levin, is worth remembering that the framers debated with great force the federal government's size and authority. Many predicted that the federal government's taxing authority, combined with its power to provide for the general welfare, might lead eventually to an unbridled, all-powerful national government dominating the states and the individual. And then from this, we've got another quote from Robert Yates. He went by Brutus in the Anti-Federalist Papers. He said, "Were this authority given, it might be said that under it the legislature could not do injustice or pursue any measures but such as were calculated to promote the public good and happiness." So he's arguing that when the government can tax people however they want, they will do it because they will argue that anything they want to fund is for the public good and happiness. And I think we see that today, where the government isn't just doing functions that it needs to serve the people. It's paying for anything that they can argue
like whales on cocaine,
the public good.
Mm-hmm. What is that? Is that a
That's Rand Paul's Festivus report. I love reading that every year. It's basically just a list of all the ridiculous things that the federal government spends money on. One of the close seconds was a clown school in Colombia. Spent I think it was like $500,000.
So good.
Federal tax dollars went to go.
If you've never seen Rand Paul's Festivus report, it's hilarious.
Just Google it. You can pull up like previous ones. It is some of the funniest stuff and saddest and most sad things you've ever read. It's like, that's where your money's going. Well, it technically not really your money, because we're borrowing to fund everything we actually spend money on. All income tax goes towards servicing the debt. So,
yeah.
Theoretically, when people say, "Oh, your tax dollars are funding XYZ," no, they're not. It's just we're taking on more debt.
Yeah, we're funding
children's
things
tax
that
dollars.
happened years and years ago.
Yes.
That's what we're paying
You know,
for.
the Bay of Pigs. That's what we're paying for right now.
Yeah, we're still paying for it.
Getting back to like the legal issue concerning income tax. So the first time income tax was instituted was during the Civil War temporarily, and then they got rid of it. One of the rare cases where the government instituted a new power for itself and didn't keep it permanently. But then in 1894, they tried creating a flat income tax, and in 1895, it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Then, when we get to the progressive era in the early 1900s, 1909, you have the 16th Amendment, which created a progressive income tax. And I think it's extremely valuable for people to understand the rates here that were instituted when we began the income tax in 1909 versus today. So on page 90 and 91, it goes through. I'll try to keep this short, but from Mark Levin, nonetheless, the early tax rates were relatively modest. The original federal income tax rates in 1913 were for inflation-adjusted brackets as follows: 1% for incomes up to $463,000, 2% for incomes between $463,000 to $1.16 million, 3% for incomes between $1.16 million to $1.74 million, and then it goes up to 5, 6, 7% as you get to like 11 million adjusted for today. That is far lower than what we see today. Top 1% AGI, adjusted gross income, of $343,000 and above paid 36.73%. For $154,000 and above, 58.66%. Sorry, this is not a direct comparison. Nick, do you know the tax? This is slightly different. It's AGI. Do you know the tax bracket rates for different
Currently,
incomes? Yeah.
roughly, the top one I believe is 37.6 for around 500 something ish thousand. Yep. And that's our top right now.
Yeah, and that used to be 7% for incomes over 11 million.
Right.
And then what are some of the lower ones?
The lower ones are, it starts at 10% and then 12%. Most people are in the 20, I think it's 20, 22, 24% is like your middle class. That's what your marginal rate is when you're in the middle
Whereas
class.
that class used to be, I mean, it used to start at, for today's earnings, what would be $463,000 was 1%. And then it went up from there.
Right.
So you see this creep, but it's not even a creep. It's like a sprint increasing these tax rates, and not just for the rich, but for everyone. Mm-hmm. So, once you give them the ability to tax your income, they're just going to keep taking more and more of it.
Yeah. And I think like a flat tax is a lot more complicated to implement than what it sounds like on paper, I think, because you also have to define what income is. Like, does that include unrealized gains like we talked about on the one podcast? Mm-hmm. Most people would say no. I don't think it should. What types of income is taxable? There is tax exempt income. You can make income and not pay tax on it if you're buying state bonds. There's a bunch of stuff like that. Like, are deductions, are they a legitimate thing? Like, can people deduct their charitable contributions and be taxed? You know, take your income, subtract your charitable contributions, and then are you taxed on that? You know, can you deduct an IRA contribution? You know, it's like all these things. I mean, there are just like Schedule 1 has most of the deductions on it on page 2, I think. So if you want to know what you can deduct, go to that page or go to Schedule A. And
so this gets into in 2016, when I was looking at who was running for president, Ted Cruz was saying, I'm going to make it so that we're going to like basically abolish the IRS. Everyone's going to pay 10% flat tax. You're going to be able to fill out your taxes on the back of a postcard. At the time, I was thinking, wow, that sounds so simple and easy.
Do you want to know what's funny about that? Is that they shrunk like the font size down so that it took up a smaller area.
But the basic premise of that is like what people are frustrated with here with taxes. So Mark Levin has it here. The National Taxpayer Advocate reported in 2012, U.S. taxpayers, both individuals and businesses, spend more than 6.1 billion hours to complete filings required by a tax code that contains almost 4 million words and that on average has more than one new provision added to it daily. Indeed, few taxpayers complete their returns without assistance. Nearly 60% hire paid pre-partners and 30% rely on commercial software. Therefore, not only is the individual's wealth diminished by confiscatory taxation applied to unconstitutional purposes, but he is tormented by the manner in which he calculates and confers his wealth to the federal government, for which fines and penalties are imposed for miscalculations. I mean, it's just crazy how the tax code, like what it's become, and the amount of time, money, people like Nick, whose sole job is these taxes.
Complying with the government's rules. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. So
I do have
a
a funny anecdote related to this. I don't know if you guys follow Sit Reps to Steer Co's. He's a great veteran to corporate transition, kind of like an advice page for guys getting out of the military, going into the corporate world, and just financial advice and just humor, like memes. But Donald Rumsfeld wrote a letter to the IRS in 2014.
Oh, yeah. This is so good.
I have seen this.
And if you
read
feel
the
like
entirety,
if you feel like you're confused, Donald Rumsfeld, one of the most powerful men in the U.S. government, probably in all time, had this to say about the federal tax code. Dear Sir,
this is a letter he wrote to the IRS.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have sent in our federal income tax and our gift tax returns for 2013. As in prior years, it is important for you to know that I have absolutely no idea whether our tax returns and our tax payments are accurate. I say that despite the fact that I am a college graduate and I try hard to make sure our tax returns are accurate. The tax code is so complex and the forms are so complicated that I know I cannot have any confidence that I know what is being requested, and therefore I cannot and do not know, and I suspect a great many Americans cannot know whether or not their tax returns are accurate. As in past years, I have spent more money than I wanted to spend, to hire an accounting firm to prepare our tax returns, and I believe they are well qualified. This note is to alert you folks that I know that I do not know whether or not my tax returns are accurate, which is a sad commentary on governance in our nation's capital. If you have questions, let me know, and I will ask our accountants to be in touch with you, providing any additional information you may think you need. I do hope at some point in my lifetime, and I am now in my 80s, so there are not many years left, that the U.S. government will simplify the U.S. tax code so that those citizens who sincerely want to pay what they should are able to do it right and know that they have done it right. I should add that my wife of 59 years, also a college graduate, has signed our joint return, but she also knows that she does not have any idea whether or not our tax payments are accurate. Sincerely, Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah, and because it is expensive to hire accounting firms, and one point that I want to make is that this isn't even included in the government spending as a percentage of GDP. Like, this is still compliance with the government, so we're already doing the 40%. Anybody who works in tax, I feel like that should also be included in that government spending number, because that's money spent complying with the government.
So government spending is probably close to 45% of GDP.
because it's an individual paying me to do their taxes, not the government.
Yeah.
But do you guys want to guess what a partner's billable rate is at a tax accounting firm?
Give it to us,
Sean.
Hourly?
Are you talking per hour?
Per hour.
$200.
Yeah.
Well, that's mine. It's 400 to 1,000. Yeah, that's the general range.
Nick, I'm severely underpaying you to do my taxes. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Yes, that's crazy.
I should have had you do my taxes.
Yeah.
Have we whipped this tax amendment to death, or has anyone got anything else on it?
I think taxes should be illegal.
Does anyone I apologize. Does anyone have anything else on it?
No, we can move on to the next couple.
All right. An amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy. Section 1. All federal departments and agencies shall expire if said departments and agencies are not individually reauthorized in standalone reauthorization bills every 3 years by a majority vote of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Section 2. All executive branch regulations exceeding an economic burden of $100 million, as determined jointly by the Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Budget Office, shall be submitted to a permanent joint committee of Congress, hereafter the Congressional Delegation Oversight Committee, for review and approval prior to their implementation. Section 3. The committee shall consist of 7 members of the House of Representatives, 4 chosen by the Speaker and 3 chosen by the Minority Leader, and 7 members of the Senate, 4 chosen by the Majority Leader and 3 chosen by the Minority Leader. No member shall serve on the committee beyond a single 3-year term. Section 4. The committee shall vote no later than 6 months from the date of the submission of the regulation to the committee. The committee shall make no change to the regulation, either approving or disapproving the regulation by majority vote as submitted. Section 5. If the committee does not act within 6 months from the date of the submission of the regulation to the committee, the regulation shall be considered disapproved and must not be implemented by the executive branch. All right, let's get into it. I guess real quick, commentary. You may have learned in school, I'm paraphrasing Mark Levin here. You may have learned in school that there's 3 branches of the federal government: the judicial, the executive, the legislative. You did not learn about the 4th branch, the bureaucracy that regulates everything.
Which it's the largest branch.
It's the largest branch by far.
The largest branch, the most expensive branch, and the most influential branch.
Yep. Yeah, and it impacts everything. It's not just business. Even people that are trying to create schools. Tim Kennedy talked about this when he was trying to create his Apogee schools as an alternative to public education. There were so many regulations that weren't even about education that he had to try to jump through. It was costing so much money just to create a school for an alternative to the sad state of public education. So it doesn't just impact businesses. It impacts your house. It impacts education. It impacts everything.
Housing and urban development, education, transportation, energy, aerospace, the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, the ATF. I mean, think of every single federal bureaucracy and institution, and they are fiddling in every single aspect of human activity that is possible.
And just to give you an idea,
the Department of Sanitation, is there not? So they even care about your poop. It's ridiculous.
To give a more clear picture of just how many regulations there are. This is from Mark Levin. The 2012 Federal Register, the official federal publication documenting administrative rules and proposed rules, exceeded 77,000 pages. The 2011 and 2010 Federal Registers were 81,247 and 81,405 pages long, respectively. In 2011, regulatory agencies issued 3,807 final rules in 1 year. Yet Congress passed and the president signed 81 laws. Yeah, it's crazy. In 2012, Bureaucracy reportedly issued 212 economically significant federal rules, each projected to impose more than $100 million in economic costs. It's not just about the restriction on freedom. The cost that is associated with these regulations is just insane.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think a lot of people agree that the government has too much bureaucracy. It's just how do you dismantle it when we're already so far in?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
I was just going to say...
You almost have to go blank slate. Sorry, Sean.
Yeah. But I mean, just like talking about like bureaucracy, regulations, rules. I mean, everybody, first thing that comes to mind is probably like the IRS or like the ATF, with ridiculous, silly rules that, they don't know what they're making rules about. But one thing that a lot of people don't talk about is, the Department of Energy, like how the Department of Energy's regulations regarding like fossil fuel consumption has gone from like getting more out of hydrocarbons, so like clean gas and like, stuff like that, to redirecting a lot of energy, like funding and research into figuring out how to make solar and wind power more efficient. And so we've gone from finding the most efficient fuel source that exists, fossil fuels, like the most bang for your buck by like kilowatt of energy generated, to being like, okay, how can we make this inferior form of energy work? So we've kind of stalled ourselves in the tech race, essentially, by trying to research these alternative forms of energy due to regulation.
It's killing innovation.
Yes.
Because the free market can figure that out. You have startups that can get investors and figure out how to do that. Or you can have the government, from a top-down approach, basically direct the system, and innovation is going to decline. So, it goes back to what we've talked about before with everyone follows incentives. And a lot of these things we've talked before, they usually have good intentions, but what are the second and third order effects of those good intentions?
Yeah. I mean, anytime you spend money, or anytime the government spends money, there's an incentive placed. Anytime you tax something, there's an incentive placed. Like, you have to really, really flesh these ideas out before you make a law.
Yeah. And a great example of that is cited in the book here. This is Mark Levin. Another example, on March 22nd, 2010, Congress passed Obamacare, a bill some 2,700 pages long. An analysis by Peter Ferreira of the Heartland Institute concludes the law establishes more than 150 new bureaucracies, agencies, boards, commissions, and programs that are empowered to tell doctors and hospitals what is quality healthcare and what is not, what are best practices in medicine, how their medical practices should be structured, and what they'll be paid and when. So even with something like this, you see Obamacare, and you see how it's going to increase the cost of healthcare. When they do analyses of that, there's also 150 new bureaucracies, agencies, boards, commissions, and programs that are created. Okay, now you also have to fund all of those. So the costs just snowball and compound on each other.
And that's not even including like the natural instinct of any bureaucracy to try and make itself relevant. If a bureaucracy solves the problem that it was created to solve, it is no longer needed and will therefore, no longer exist.
Yeah, and so
they just perpetuate the issue.
That's where this book and Mark Levin do such a good job of not just saying, like we're going to say at the end of this, some amendments that we'd propose. He actually, as a lawyer, drafts out these sections for each of these that are very specific. And which section is it? It looks like it is section... it's one of the sections in here where he allows for these agencies and commissions that are created to be reevaluated by Congress. Do we still need that? And if we don't need it, all right, let's get rid of it. Do we still need a COVID-19 task force? No, but is it still sucking up money? Yes. So this happens with any bureaucracy that is created. It just grows and grows and grows. And you see this in California. I think Michael Schellenberger has talked about this a lot in California, where you have all this money going to the homeless problem, but then you have all these people in this bureaucracy that are actually being paid like $200,000, $240,000 to be a part of this solution to homelessness. And they're just lining their pockets, and the bureaucracy grows. And when you throw money at a problem, but the money isn't actually going to the problem, you're not improving anything. You're just paying more people.
Yeah. I do want to go back to the Affordable Care Act, like briefly. I think we could do a whole episode on how messed up like the health insurance industry is.
Yep.
But I mean, you're essentially, I mean, it's socializing healthcare. If I'm a very healthy person, I don't want health insurance. I shouldn't be penalized for that. I should be able to evaluate my risk, how much I have to pay. A health insurance company, which health insurance is I think it's the only insurance that you can't discriminate based on any reason at all. Life insurance you can, auto insurance you can. Yeah. I thought they evaluated all your lifestyle factors and all that for life insurance.
They can.
Yeah, so I mean, you could argue that is a form of discrimination, because if you're someone that smokes cigarettes, they're going to charge you a higher premium. You can
discriminate, but you can't discriminate for health insurance.
No,
I don't believe you can.
The charging of higher premiums could be seen as a form of discrimination.
Right. Yeah. And that's mainly what I'm. Yeah, and I'm saying that you can discriminate for life insurance, auto insurance, any other kind of insurance, but I don't think you're allowed to at all for health insurance. They can't look at my diet, be like, oh, he's trying to keep his health in good shape, but they can't charge me less.
Yeah, going back to the weights side, even though this is a freedom episode, this gets into how there's a lot of people in the fitness industry that take really good care of themselves that would like to pay less in health insurance because they work out 5 days a week and eat a healthy diet, and they're forced to pay for the obese person that eats McDonald's every day and doesn't work out. And I don't know, there's definitely considerations with pre-existing conditions, genetic conditions you're born with that impact that, where it's just because you were born with this condition doesn't mean you should have to pay more.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother conversation. We did do an episode back in Clarksville a long time ago. It's in the 30s if you scroll way back in our episodes. But we did do an episode on the healthcare industry and insurance and everything like that. So if you're interested in that, go check out that episode. I think it might be called Healthcare Mega Episode, but it's back around episode 30, 35, something like that.
Also, I'm using discriminate in the true sense of the word, not how people typically use it in the news and stuff like that. So just want to point that out.
Is everybody ready to move on?
Yep.
All right. Next amendment. An amendment to promote free enterprise. Section 1, Congress's power to regulate commerce is not a plenary grant of power to the federal government to regulate and control economic activity, but a specific grant of power limited to preventing states from impeding commerce and trade among the several states. Section 2, Congress's power to regulate commerce does not extend to activity within a state, whether or not it affects interstate commerce, nor does it extend to compelling an individual or entity to participate in commerce or trade. So this gets at the heart of the federal government limiting and making rules based off specific trade. I think the New Deal is a really good example of this. And during World War II, when they could regulate your garden, the government is not supposed to be able to do that. They're only supposed to regulate trade between states. But we've seen with how they've interpreted things and the Supreme Court, how they take interstate commerce and they say that anything that's created in that state becomes interstate commerce. So they've adapted this really loose interpretation of interstate commerce.
The only thing I really have to say on that is that at least from a tax perspective, the way income is sourced to a state varies state to state. There's something called, I believe it's the Multi-State Tax Commission that more and more states are joining. I think it's around 20 are part of it right now, that all kind of agreed to source those receipts in a similar way. But I think Illinois had one that was ruled unconstitutional because of you could have, it's the formulas are complicated, but they were taxing much, much more than they should have been from an out of state.
Yeah. An easy
company.
Example to give a specific of that is some states, I believe Illinois and California, determined that they would start taxing athletes on. So if, say, Packers go play the 49ers in San Francisco, now California can tax the Packers player, say they tax Jordan Love's game check for the game that he played in San Francisco, even though he's employed in Wisconsin.
Well, that's how it generally works across the board.
That's how it works.
Yeah, like everything I've seen, I've done a few athletes coaches who do that, and like that's generally
so they get double taxed in Wisconsin because that's
no, like they aren't double taxed. Maybe they're
that's how the new this was like last year, I think, that California, Illinois were trying to implement this, and it would make players get double taxed when they were playing away games.
So generally speaking, if you are double taxed, you get a credit for taxes paid to another state. So while you might be living in Wisconsin, who has a lower tax rate than California, Wisconsin would give you a tax credit to the extent of their tax rate.
Okay.
So you would still be paying essentially California rates, but like say California's 12, Wisconsin's 6, you wouldn't be paying 18%. You would be paying 12%.
Okay. I guess another example of this is California trying to tax businesses for years, like 5 years after they left the state and incorporated in a new state.
Yeah.
They were trying to get Elon with that because Elon he moved to like Delaware, and now he's trying to actually move from Delaware to Texas as far as like his incorporation of Tesla. But California was trying to keep collecting taxes from him at their high rate for 5 years after he moved.
Yeah, there's 3 states you don't want to mess with, and those are California, Illinois, and New York. Those states, they're long tax returns, they're very complicated, and they try to get you any way they can.
Generally,
moving on, anyone got any last thoughts?
No.
Sean's from Illinois.
I don't even want to think about Illinois taxes. Hey, Mercy.
Moving on, an amendment to protect private property. We did get into this a little bit in the last episode with eminent domain and how it violates the Constitution. But Section 1, when any government entity acts not to secure, when any governmental entity acts not to secure private property right against actions that injure property owners, but take property for public use from a property owner by actual seizure or through regulation, which taking results a market value reduction in the property, interference with the use of the property, or financial loss to the property owner exceeding $10,000, the government shall compensate fully said property owner for such losses. That's the only section in this one.
I would say that needs to be even lower. I would say $2,500, because given the state of Americans' personal finance, $2,500, well, 10 grand will bankrupt people. Majority of the U.S. population, and $2,500 is probably going to clean out most people's emergency funds. So it needs to be.
I mean, we've gone over the stats on this before. How, what is it like, Nick? Do you know the exact percentage? It was over 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, oh, it's pretty high. I don't remember the exact, but
yeah, and I mean this is a violation of the core thoughts and principles of Western democracy. So we can go all the way back to John Locke, who was very influential on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And here we have in the book, so these are Locke's words. Locke asserted, the government cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. And then also, so John Locke was British. Also from Britain, this is Blackstone in his commentaries on the laws of England. So great is the regard for the law of private property that it will not authorize the least violation of it, no, not even for the general good of the whole community. If a new road, for instance, were to be made through the grounds of a private person, it might perhaps be extensively beneficial to the public, but the law permits no man or set of man to do this without consent of the owner of the land. And so this is just like we talked about in the last episode. It's eminent domain here is the biggest offender of this that we see today.
Mm-hmm. Hey, wait, how does this differ from the one in the Bill of Rights that we talked about last week? Because
so the Bill of Rights just isn't as specific about it, and because it isn't as specific, it's been trampled over. So this amendment would just make it more specific so that it's more obvious that it's unconstitutional, I think, in my opinion. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah. No, I mean, pulling up the outline from last episode, where is it? I think it was Fourth Amendment.
Fifth Amendment, isn't it?
No. Where did it go?
Here, well, while Sean's finding that,
Yeah.
I just want to make a quick point about.
Sorry, Fifth Amendment.
Did you find it? Okay.
Yeah, nor shall private property
Go
be
ahead.
taken for public use without just compensation. That's like the ending
Yeah, and we got into how.
phrase.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
the without just
Nick had
compensation
something, or-
allows the federal government to pretty much do whatever they want.
Right. And that's what I was about to point out is like what's fully compensated. Like there are so many different ways to value something, and who gets to do that? Is it the government? Is it the person who owns it? Is it a third party? You know, I mean, like you have market value, but that isn't always known. You have how much you paid for it, how much it would cost to replace it. There's all these different ways to value.
If you just let people come up with their own valuation of just, they can say that Mar-a-Lago is only worth $18 million, despite it being able to sell for like $1 or $2 billion.
Yeah,
I think if
honestly, I think
if the federal government's going to take your stuff, you should be able to put any price tag on it that you want, and then the federal government gets to decide whether it's worth it. You know?
Yeah.
that's what I was about to say. Yeah.
Like if they want to take
because then that's a free transaction.
Yeah, if they want to take my left shoe for some reason, if they need another size 11 and a half, you know, I should be able to charge them $10 million for my shoe, you know, because that is
and
my
they'll probably
personal
say
property.
we don't need it.
Yeah, it's like,
Yeah.
oh, you don't want to pay $10 million for my worn out running shoe? Well, too bad. You know, that's what it should be. But sadly, it's not.
All right. Ready to move on?
Yeah.
An amendment to grant the states authority to directly amend the Constitution. This gets into what Sean was talking about earlier with how, or I think maybe it was Nick, about how these amendments, it'd be really hard to get them approved. This helps a little bit. So Section 1, the state legislatures, whenever 2/3 shall deem it necessary, may adopt amendments to the Constitution. Section 2, each state legislature adopting said amendments must adopt amendments identical in subject and wording to the other state legislatures. Section 3, a 6-year time limit is placed on the adoption of an amendment starting from the date said amendment is adopted by the first state legislature. Each state legislature adopting said amendment shall provide an exact copy of the adopted amendment along with an affidavit signed and dated by the Speaker of the state legislature to the Archivist of the United States within 15 calendar days of its adoption. Section 4, upon adoption of an amendment, a state legislature may not rescind the amendment or modify it during the 6-year period in which the amendment is under consideration by the several other state legislatures. And then, I guess if we want to lay the basis for people that don't know, Article 5 of the Constitution sets forth the two processes for amending the Constitution. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress. So currently, since the inception of the Constitution, to get an amendment approved, you need 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or you need 3/4 of the states. This Liberty Amendment proposed by Mark Levin would make it so that you can have 2/3 of states within a 6-year period approve such an amendment. So it kind of lowers the standard for the states there. But that 2/3, 66%, that's still a super majority. It's way above 50%.
Yeah, I mean it sounds really good. I just don't know if it would actually happen. Like if states would use their power, because it doesn't seem like they ever do. I don't know. Like, do they? That you know?
I mean, we
of,
talked
Sean?
about this on the last episode when we were getting into federalism and the balance between states and the government. Sean was talking a lot about how these governors and state legislatures have been kind of weak and haven't really asserted themselves against the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe going from. Sorry, I was going to say like maybe going from 3/4 to 2/3 would encourage them to start trying more. I don't know.
Maybe. Or maybe they're just really lame and don't like to do their job.
That's probably it, but
it's more of a lack of vitality at the state level and not a lack of ability, I would say. It's just people who, like I said earlier, the state legislature and executive branch should not be viewed as being in AAA and trying to get, into the major leagues. It should be viewed as almost for the last century.
That's how it's been viewed, though. Going back to Woodrow Wilson, Mark Levin put this in the book. In 1908, Woodrow Wilson made clear the plans he and others set in motion when he declared, "No doubt a great deal of nonsense has been talked about the inalienable rights of the individual, and a great deal that was mere vague sentiment and pleasing speculation had been put forward as fundamental principle." Wilson added, "Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and practice." So essentially, the federal government should evolve into this Leviathan.
Yeah.
All right, are we good there?
Yeah.
Should we move on to the next one?
We can move on. Mark Levin is going much more in depth, so again, we encourage you to read the book here. All right, next we've got an amendment to grant the states authority to check Congress. Section 1, there shall be a minimum of 30 days between the engrossing of a bill or resolution, including amendments, and its final passage by both houses of Congress. During the engrossment period, the bill or resolution shall be placed on the public record, and there shall be no changes to this final bill or resolution. Section 2, Section 1 may be overridden by 2/3 vote of the members of each house of Congress. Section 3, upon 3/5 vote of the state legislatures, the states may override a federal statute. Section 4, upon 3/5 vote of the state legislatures, the states may override executive branch regulations exceeding an economic burden of $100 million after said regulations have been finally approved by the Congressional Delegation Oversight Committee. And he says, see Chapter 9, an amendment to grant the states authority to directly amend the Constitution. Section 5, the state's override shall not be the subject of litigation or review in any federal or state court or oversight of interference by Congress or the President. Section 6, the state's override authority must be exercised no later than 24 months from the date the President has signed the statute into law or the Congressional Delegation Oversight Committee has approved a final regulation, after which the states are prohibited from exercising the override. So this is essentially going to empower the states to become watchdogs for poor legislation and regulation from the federal government.
I think one of the key aspects of this proposed amendment is the states being immune to federal and state court overruling their turn, because they are supposed to be the check on the federal government, and if the federal government has a check on them, it's kind of defeats the purpose. So I think one of the key aspects of this is definitely the legislative branch at the state level being immune to any type of judicial overturn. So
yeah, they're basically the final veto.
Yeah, which in reality is the way it should be, because even though our system of government is not perfect, the legislature is the most influenced by the people. And if the people are supposed to be the government, then the legislature should be the kind of final arbiter.
Yeah, and the states are supposed to regulate the people as needed, and the federal government's supposed to regulate the states. The federal government's not supposed to regulate the people.
Yes.
And this brings us back to that. And that's the system of federalism. All right, moving on. an amendment to protect the vote. Section 1, citizens in every state, territory, and this is the last one, guys. So, Section 1, citizens in every state, territory, and the District of Columbia shall produce valid photographic identification documents demonstrating evidence of their citizenship issued by the state government for the state in which the voter resides as a requirement for registering to vote and voting in any primary or general election for president, vice president, and members of Congress. Section 2, provisions shall be made by the state legislatures to provide such citizenship designated photographic identification documents at no cost to individuals unable to afford fees associated with acquiring such documents. Section 3, early voting in any general election for president, vice president, and members of Congress shall not be held more than 30 calendar days prior to the national day of election, except for active duty military personnel, for whom early voting shall not commence more than 45 calendar days prior to the national day of election. Section 4, where registration and or voting is not in person but by mail, citizens must submit an approved citizen-designated photo identification and other reliable information to state election officials to register to vote and request ballots for voting no later than 45 calendar days before the primary or general elections for president, vice president, or members of Congress. Registration forms and ballots must be returned and signed to the voter and must either be mailed or hand-delivered by the voter to state election officials. If delivered by a third party, the voter must provide written authorization for the person making the delivery, and the third party must sign a statement certifying that he did not unduly influence the voter's decisions. That's ballot harvesting right there. Section 5, electronic or other technology-based voting systems for purposes of registering and voting in national elections are prescribed unless a reliable identification and secure voting regimen is established by the state legislature. All right, I want to hear you guys on this first.
I'll take the photo ID one, that was like the first one, right?
Yeah.
All right, I just don't know why this is so controversial. I think that I can't think of a logical argument against it. Most of the arguments against it that I hear, I think are honestly pretty racist because it leans on the fact that, minorities can't figure out how to get an ID. I don't know if you guys have seen like the man on the street ones
it's crazy.
Interviewing kids on college campuses and then going to like a predominantly black area. And they're like, why don't they think we can get IDs? I just don't understand it, but
it doesn't make a lot of sense. And just for people that think requiring photo ID is somehow discriminatory, I'm just going to give a list here that Mark Levin gives. Requiring a photo ID to vote is neither an onerous nor unique requirement in the 21st century. Identification is required to obtain a driver's license and passport, buy alcohol or cigarettes, or Zyn, apply for food stamps, unemployment, and various forms of welfare, open a bank account, cash a check, purchase a firearm, lease an apartment, rent a car, secure a marriage license, clear airport security, enter most federal buildings, and even meet the president or vice president in person. Yet when it comes to state efforts to ensure the integrity of the electoral process through modest voter identification laws, there are howls of protest from certain political activists and insincere public officials. Merely requiring an individual to establish eligibility for voting is portrayed as the resurrection of Jim Crow laws. So as Nick was saying, doesn't seem to be a logical argument against this. It's just become somehow this emotionally charged fallacy that people can't get IDs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you guys pretty much summarized that. It's anyone who's like, no, I don't want to know who's voting. It's kind of ridiculous.
Right, as if it's like, you need an ID for all these
people
things.
Accountable and like actually tracking who voted. It just opens the door wide to abuse, fraud, and corruption, which I think.
So are you guys both? Huh? Are you guys both in support? Are you guys both in support of this Liberty Amendment then?
100%.
At least the first part. I want to look. Yeah.
All right.
I think with the rest of
this
it.
Was the only. I think this is the only one that I do not support.
Like the entire thing, or do you support parts of it?
The entire thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Why?
Surprised?
Do you plan to commit election fraud?
No, I do not.
It's going to have 10 mail-in ballots.
Yeah. So the reason that I don't support this is whenever I'm looking at legislation or an amendment like this, I want to go back to the Constitution. And if we look at the 10th Amendment, which we talked about last week, we have to be sincere across the board. This is not the federal government's right to regulate. This is a state right. Voting within the state is even for federal elections, that is regulated by the states. So I disagree that this should be an amendment to the Constitution and that the federal government should get involved in this, even though it's so logical and we would like to see it adopted in every state. I think it is still on the states to regulate this. So I would like to see this amendment drafted and accepted in all of the states, but I don't think I don't think the federal government should be adopting this to regulate voting.
What about specifically only for federal elections? You know what I mean?
So even federal elections are still regulated by the state.
Yeah. But
that is how it works. Even though it would make sense that you're voting for a federal position, it's still a state's right.
I mean, at first glance, I 100% agree with it. The only issue that I see is that, say 45 states accept that the last 5 could manipulate a federal election.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's also why we have the Electoral College in place. So even if California decides that they still don't want voter ID, okay, well, I mean, that state's going to vote blue no matter who.
It is also within the power of the vice president to reject the electors that are sent. So like if 45 states are like, yeah, we're going to have legitimate voter ID laws, this way we can ensure that our elections are free, fair, and, without fraud, then the 5 states who are like, no, like we don't want to know, like we think people of color don't know how to drive and buy beer. If that's what they're saying, then it is within the power of, the vice president, who's the certifier, like the Senate certifying the election. He can be like, no, we're just not going to count the votes from California because we can't trust them. So
technically, but I think for the vice president to actually go and do something like that, you would have to have like solid, legitimate proof of like
that it did occur.
Video proof of widespread voter fraud and manipulation, which even in 2020, when people were making voter fraud accusations, and it's not just 2020, for the past 20 years, every election has been pretty much contested in this way. There's never been like enough widespread proof that would actually give the vice president grounds to do that.
But I mean, maybe change it from the vice president to like 2/3 of Congress or something like that. Because then, if 45 states have that in their state constitution, you could probably get 2/3 or 3/4 just being like, these guys aren't playing by the same rules as us, or like these votes can't count. Or I don't know if it's Congress or if it's someone else, but you could change the power from the vice president to someone else.
Yeah. All right. Anyone got anything further on that? I think we covered it, and little surprise there.
No.
All right. That is the Liberty Amendments. Again, we all really thought this was a good read and would encourage everyone to go grab a copy. Or I think, Sean, did you just listen to it for free on Spotify?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's with a lot of these book club books, they are on Spotify for free if you
have premium.
All right.
If you have premium. Okay.
All right. Are you guys ready to go through our amendments?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure how long this episode has been, so let's just maybe
I'm tracking an hour and a half right now.
Hour and a half right now. Okay, we're going to make these super short. We're just going to introduce our ideas for amendments and maybe like a 1 or 2 minute discussion on back and forth on each.
Okay. You start with, mine are first on there.
Yeah, Nick, go ahead. Nick's already introduced one of his. So.
This one, I came up with this on the spot, so please point out any flaws you see with it, but it's the federal government shall not compensate any for-profit entity for services rendered barring a declaration of war. So I'm talking about services, not goods here, because like I know that, government needs to buy toilet paper, stuff like that. But I think any services that they would contract people for in general can be provided by the free market, and the free market would do it better. You could also hire nonprofits to do it, but I think we would have to place like income, like W-2 income limits on nonprofits at that point. And I think it would kind of help end the bribery that we call lobbying. Because if you got a big donor, they help you get elected, you can contract their services in some way. So that's kind of like the goal of it. But
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay.
You guys got anything?
Not off the top of my head. I don't think it's a bad idea. I would just so like you're talking more about like not like how are you defining like a service that like
a government contractor, like some or like a lot of like corporations will like have like a government contracting arm kind of. I think that gets tough from like an audit perspective because the government does need to be audited and you need a third party to do that. So, I mean, I haven't fully fleshed it out, but I'm sure, you could just add more to like allow for stuff like that. But that's kind of like the basis of what I was trying to get at.
Gotcha. Okay. I mean, I don't think that's a bad idea. It would definitely help with the lobbying issue for sure.
All right. Should we go to my next one?
Yeah. Let's hear it.
All right. So we touched on this earlier. I don't think that there should be a tax based on income. I think there should either be like higher like consumption / sales tax or high death taxes. I don't know why there's an income tax because that places an incentive on people not to work, not to invest. And I think if you have higher sales taxes, I do see the issue of, people are less likely to spend, but they'll also have more expendable income because their income won't be taxed. So that, I don't know, it might be a moot point, but the one thing I do like about that is like we talked about how billionaires are taxed at 8.1% because they're taxed on income.
Yeah, on average, because when you take that average, a lot of them are able to pay very little tax because of the way they're able to manipulate the tax code.
Yeah, because they got a lot of money for lawyers and so they wouldn't be able to get around a consumption tax because anything that you're consuming, you're paying tax on. Or like a luxury tax, I think that is subject to manipulation. But, if you tax certain types of goods, like you buy a yacht, you pay a very high tax on that. An airplane, you pay very high tax on that. But I do think that can be manipulated, or just like a sales tax that like accepts certain goods. Like you could accept clothing and food, like basic needs. So that's sales tax. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I think specifying luxury would open it to like government manipulation, but just like a flat sales tax on any type of consumption wouldn't allow the government to like decide winners and losers. Because if it's like a Snickers bar is taxed at 2%, just the same as your, Dodge Challenger that you just bought, if you're paying a 2% consumption tax on all of that, it's not deciding any winners and losers. So.
Yeah. And that's definitely like the risk with the luxury tax. And then death taxes, did you guys have anything more on sales tax?
No.
Okay. Death taxes, I think to make this work, you would have to eliminate the whole trust thing. The current estate exclusion is $13.61 million or $27.22 million for married couples. All of that gets passed on tax-free to their heirs. That's a very, very large tax-free transaction. Pretty much anytime money changes hands, it's generally taxed. I don't know why they accept inheritances at such a high level. It used to be a lot lower, but it's gotten higher recently. So not only do you get that estate exclusion, your heirs aren't taxed, you also get something called a step up in basis. So like say Ted was an original investor in Amazon, bought his shares for $1. It's currently valued at $50,000. So you've been holding that your entire life because you're like, this is a great thing I want to buy and hold. Ted dies, I'm his heir. My basis is now $50,000. So if I sell it, I pay zero capital gains on it. Had Ted sold it, he would have paid capital gains on 49,999. So that's another thing with how wealth gets transferred from one generation to the next. And then you also have trusts set up, which the wealthy pay a lot of money to lawyers to set these trusts up so that when they die, they can essentially go beyond this $27 million and to have all of this money transferred tax-free to their heirs. And then also what we see a lot is second and third generations tend to squander this kind of money.
Yeah.
They don't spend it well. They aren't productive members of society. They are definitely net consumers, which they just consume more than they ever produced. Like I would rather be a net producer. You know, I want to leave this world having net production. Like I want to have produced more than I consumed. I want to leave something behind. And I think that the second and third generations are a big drain on the economy and essentially get to have people do things for them for free for what they didn't earn. And I don't like that, but
How socialist of you, Nick.
I know.
I mean, like,
So yeah,
with death taxes, like these people are, since they're net consumers, that money is just going to someone else regardless.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily see that as an issue. Like if
Yeah, I don't see that as being a drain on the economy.
That's what I like. What?
If they're consuming, they're still contributing to the economy.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say it's a drain on the economy.
Right, they are, but from an ethical standpoint, they get to enjoy things that they didn't earn, and I don't like that. But
lame.
Yeah.
you know, and sorry, go
Part
ahead.
of it is then you're de-incentivizing people to like build an empire they can leave behind. But
One other thing is that I think that would incentivize a lot of spending before death too, because you can't take it with you and it's gone afterwards. So I think you would see the spending by the person who earned the money, who I think would also spend it better than a second or third generation. So that money actually would be spent earlier than later, which is generally better. But yeah.
it's definitely an interesting thought process. I think there's a lot more there with like someone handing down real estate, but not a lot of cash, you know, just someone that's worth $800,000 that leaves behind a piece of real estate to their children. Then they have to pay taxes on that, even though they don't have cash.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly how that would work with higher death taxes, but it's definitely an interesting idea.
Well, that's why the exclusion exists. So I'm essentially arguing for like a much, much lower exclusion. You know, for a married couple, $27 million, I think that is too high personally. Maybe you disagree. We can talk about like the exact amount, but yeah, for somebody who's worth like $1 million or $2 million when they die, I think they should be allowed to pass that on freely. And yeah.
All right, Sean, what did you have?
I think, was there one more?
I did have one more.
Oh, wait,
yeah.
there's another one? Oh, wow.
Yeah. So last one, acts of the federal government shall be limited to the physical protection of the U.S. citizens and arbitrating civil disagreements. I think that is like those are the only two purposes of government that I can think of off the top of my head. And physical protection is kind of meant to be interpreted broadly, or like it could be interpreted broadly depending on who you are. But you guys have anything?
I've kind of been on that train for a while. Just like leave everything alone, and the only purpose you have is to make sure we don't get invaded and prevent disagreements from going into violence. You know, potentially providing courts of law and protection from foreign interference. That's about it. So I could see that being a beneficial amendment. Ted,
Ted, you're writing a lot.
No, yeah, I'm just writing some ideas down. But Sean, let's hear.
I was gonna say I didn't see any of yours, so. All right.
All right, I can go with mine.
No, I got mine ready to go.
Yeah, Sean did take one or two of mine.
Yeah.
Two
Also,
of mine. So I had to read you.
So elected.
I don't know if we announced this when Sean would join, but he was a political science major, right? So this is right up his alley.
Yeah, it's way harder than like physics or anything like that. It's a famous science fact. No. But elected members of state and federal governments and their immediate families are prohibited from owning or trading shares in publicly traded companies whilst in office, and must divest themselves prior to taking office. And the only exception to that would be that they would be allowed to own FANG, like large mutual funds like SPY, stuff like that. So that we see this issue of politicians sitting on the commissions and boards of that regulate industries, and then they are passing legislation that affects those industries. So that allows them to have this massive amount of essentially insider trading, but they're setting the rules for the industry. So they're going to be able to know who the winners are going to be, and essentially allows them to pick these individual companies to win, right?
Yeah.
And
we talked about. Sorry, we talked about this a lot in the politician trading episode. What was it, 77 or 78? So go back a few and listen to that. Yeah, it was episode 77.
Yeah. But essentially, by only allowing them to own SPY, these index funds and mutual funds, if they do something that's good for the whole economy, then they're going to benefit. You know what I mean? So it kind of prevents them from individually picking winners and only enacting legislation that improves, if they are going to pass anything that regulates the economy, it's going to raise the entire economy, not just one specific industry or company. Any thoughts on that?
I'm completely on board with that.
Yeah,
that's when we talked about the term limits on Congress earlier, and how I think that you would remove the money incentive from public office by that, and I think it's a better way to do that than term limits.
Mm-hmm. Then I have corporate entities and foreign entities are forbidden from donating to any political candidate. All political donations must come from private citizens of the United States. So you have to be a U.S. citizen acting in your private capacity to donate to a political campaign. So it's essentially reversing Citizens United, which is the most ridiculous,
such a fraud.
law.
Yeah.
No, it essentially allowed every single politician to get bought by, and the fact that we allow foreign aligned think tanks and interest groups to donate to our political candidates, how does that make any sense? I don't care if it's Canada, who might as well be a part of America. I don't want Canadians telling, the senator from New York that hey, we're going to give you $1 million if you, lobby for this pipeline from natural gas fields. Right. So there's all sorts of interest, and there should be zero input from foreign governments and foreign entities in when deciding who is going to win, essentially, because in a way, your political, the amount of money that you get during your campaign is a pretty large factor in whether or not you're going to win, because that's the amount of advertising you can do, that's the amount of campaigning you can do, that's the amount of people that you can employ that knock doors and distribute pamphlets. And so if your budget is $1,000 versus $1 million, the person with $1 million budget is going to be, kind of have overpowering assets and is going to be more likely to win. And if all that money's coming from corporate interests, they're kind of owned.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you guys think about publicly funded elections? I'm just curious, because that would, then you have zero donors. I think individuals donating are better.
I think ideally
corporate interests, but
ideally it should be when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were running against each other. Like, they should not campaign, period. It should be like,
okay.
It should be like, hey, I, Sean Doyle, I'm running for president. That's it. And like, I can publish like a website with the things that I believe in, but there are no commercials. There are no big speeches. There's nothing. It's just, hey, like, do I like this guy's ideas? And that's it. Or you could just do it even more.
There's a movie that came out.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a movie that came out somewhat recently with Steve Carell where it was basically, I think it was like this town in Wisconsin was exploiting this whole system of campaign donations, and they revived this entire town just based off like tricking both of the parties into contributing massive amounts of money to this one election. But it was a pretty interesting movie, and at the end they went over some of the stats on how much is spent on the election cycles, and it's a crazy amount of money that's spent that could be much better spent on productive things for society.
Again, not included in government spending as a percentage of GDP.
Yeah. It's true.
It's
Yeah, and then finally,
right,
just
Sean,
abolishing the Fed, and that's it.
Yep.
Do you want to talk about that second one or no?
Abolishing the Fed. I think that's his third one.
The foreign ownership one.
Yeah,
I just saw
I don't
you
know.
on
I think that's something that needs to be fleshed out a little more. But basically, foreign ownership of U.S. based companies can be no more than 10%. So, like, Italy has to sell us Jeep. You know, like, I don't like that Fiat owns Jeep. It's sad. I think that's it's not a perfect.
Sean
amendment.
stole some of mine, so
Sure.
some of mine are similar to Sean. But first one is foreign nationals and entities shall not be allowed to own land within the boundaries of the United States. It's kind of similar to his U.S.-based companies, but when you see China buying up all of our farmland and buying up land around military bases, I think that's really alarming and should
you should be worried about that.
Yeah, that's a major threat to our national security and our food security. Does anyone disagree with that one? I'm not sure if I've thought it out fully and if there's arguments against it.
Like, free trade is always something that I've kind of wrestled with because I understand where you guys are like coming from. But also that's not good for markets. But if they have ill intentions and they can come in, I mean, it could be like a national security issue at that point.
It is.
Where I think that kind of trumps, an economic benefit.
Yeah.
I mean,
free trade is a tough one.
What economic benefit are we getting from allowing a hostile foreign government to buy up the majority of fertile land on our continent, and then who knows, they could be destroying the health of the land. They could be doing the opposite of regenerative farming and just be stealing all the topsoil and shipping it back to Beijing. Like, who knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's other things there with how that's currently happening with U.S.-based companies destroying the topsoil and regenerative agriculture.
Oh, yeah.
But we've talked about that a little bit before, and for the sake of time, I'll move on. I also agreed with abolishing the Fed, and linked with that, I would try to get us back on the gold standard. I'm not sure how that would work once we've gone off the gold standard, how to get back on it. But the Fed manipulating interest rates, it's just, in high school, my dad explained to me that the ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, was going to lead to massive inflation. And at that point, I started to get really passionate about limiting government spending and limiting the actions of the Fed. And it seems like people are finally now realizing that ZIRP was a horrible idea. But yeah, I mean, it's almost like we've gone down this course, and how do you fix it at this point? Because the debt and spending is so far out of control. We talked about this with Chris Nahibi several episodes back. That would have been somewhere in around episode 60, I think, that we talked to Chris. But definitely a good episode to check out. And I think when we go to California and sit down with Chris and Saeed from the Higher Standard, this would be a really good conversation to have, because them being in banking, they're very knowledgeable about the Fed, and they definitely have a different viewpoint of it than we do.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that the currency used in a quote unquote free market is controlled by a single centralized entity, like that tells you right there that
the board of governors, which is there's 7 voting members on the Fed, the board of governors.
Yeah.
And they basically control money and interest rates, and
it's a privately owned.
It is crazy that
Citibank owns the majority of the shares in the Federal Reserve.
I think we need,
by the banks.
I don't fully understand it. From like what I've heard about it, it's like mostly it's like part public, part private. I'm pretty sure it pays dividends. And I think we should do a full episode just on how the Fed works, because I want to know more about it.
Yeah. And it's definitely something that we'll talk about more with Chris and Saeed. Yeah. Maybe we can get Saeed on here soon. Mm-hmm. All right. That wraps up the Liberty Amendments. I know it was a long episode, but I think there was a lot of good stuff in here. And if you enjoy, again, this new way that this new direction we've taken with the book club, definitely let us know. Yeah. And don't forget to subscribe if you're listening on YouTube.
Thanks for joining us today at Weights and Wealth. And don't forget to apply today's lessons to live healthy and wealthy.
If this conversation will contribute to your fitness and financial gains, please share it with a friend or family member and give a 5-star review so more people can lift bigger weights and get bigger bank accounts.